The familiar yellow paint and checkered stripe pattern of the taxi cab that pulled up to the curb outside my apartment building at 11:30 on a Friday night should have represented safety, convenience, and the reliable transportation that millions of people depend on every day in cities across America. I had called for a cab to take me home from a late dinner with friends, choosing what I thought was the safest and most predictable option for late-night transportation in an urban environment where walking alone or waiting for public transit could expose me to the dangers and unpredictability of city streets after dark. The yellow cab had always been a symbol of urban reliability, a regulated transportation service that provided professional drivers metered fares, and the kind of accountability that made it the preferred choice for people who needed safe, dependable transportation during all hours of the day and night. But tonight was different. Tonight, the familiar comfort of a licensed taxi service was about to become something far more sinister than a simple ride home. As I settled into the back seat and gave the driver my address, I began to notice that his behavior and the condition of the vehicle suggested that this was not a legitimate taxi service, but something much more dangerous that was using the appearance and recognition of a yellow cab to gain access to unsuspecting passengers who trusted the familiar symbols of regulated transportation. My name is Maria, and that night taught me that yellow cabs aren't just urban transportation. They are mobile hunting grounds where predators use the trust and familiarity of taxi services to isolate and attack victims who assume that licensed transportation will provide safety and security during their travels. Ever wondered why some people suddenly refuse to take taxis alone after dark? Ever questioned why certain passengers seem paranoid about verifying driver credentials and route accuracy? Share this video if you've ever felt uncomfortable during a taxi ride and sensed that your driver had intentions that had nothing to do with professional transportation service, because tonight, I'm sharing 3 true accounts that will make you reconsider every assumption you've made about taxi safety. These aren't exaggerated stories or attempts to discourage people from using taxi services. These are real experiences from real passengers who learned that when you get into a taxi, especially during late-night hours or in unfamiliar areas, you place your safety in the hands of strangers whose backgrounds, intentions, and mental stability may have nothing to do with the professional standards that passengers expect. Sarah Mitchell was a 26-year-old journalist who regularly used yellow cabs for transportation throughout New York City, relying on taxi services to travel efficiently between assignments, interviews, and social activities in a city where owning a car was impractical and public transportation didn't always provide the flexibility that her demanding career required. Sarah had been using taxi services in New York for over 4 years, and was familiar with the standard procedures, pricing, and safety features that legitimate cab companies provided. Sarah had never experienced any significant safety concerns during her hundreds of taxi rides throughout the city. On the evening of October 15, 2022, Sarah hailed what appeared to be a legitimate yellow cab outside a restaurant in Manhattan, where she had been having dinner with colleagues planning to take the taxi to her apartment in Brooklyn, as she had done countless times before. The vehicle had all the external appearances of a legitimate New York City taxi, including the proper yellow paint scheme, roof light, and medallion number. Sarah entered the taxi and provided her Brooklyn address to the driver, who appeared to acknowledge her destination, and began driving in what seemed to be the correct direction toward her neighborhood. The driver was a middle-aged man who initially seemed professional and knowledgeable about city streets. But as the taxi progressed through Manhattan and toward the bridges that would take them to Brooklyn, Sarah began to notice that the driver was taking an unusual route that seemed to involve unnecessary detours and extended travel through areas that were not on the direct path to her destination. Comment below if you've ever questioned a taxi driver about their route and received evasive or suspicious responses, because what Sarah discovered about this fake taxi operation proved that some criminals use the trusted appearance of yellow cabs to gain access to unsuspecting passengers who assume they're using legitimate transportation services. Sarah's concern about the route escalated when she realized that the taxi's meter was not running and that the driver had not activated the standard fare calculation system that was required for all legitimate taxi rides in New York City. When Sarah pointed out the inactive meter, the driver claimed that the system was malfunctioning. The situation became more alarming when Sarah discovered that the taxi's interior features were not consistent with legitimate New York City cabs, including the absence of standard safety equipment passenger information displays and the regulatory notices that were required in all licensed vehicles. Sarah's attempts to exit the vehicle were prevented by the driver, who had activated door locks that trapped her in the back seat and made it impossible for her to leave the taxi during stops at traffic lights. The driver's control of the vehicle's security systems indicated that the fake taxi had been specifically modified to prevent passengers from escaping. The fake driver began to drive toward increasingly isolated areas of the city, taking Sarah away from populated neighborhoods and toward industrial areas where screams for help would be unlikely to be heard, and where the driver could conduct whatever criminal activities he had planned without interference. Sarah's escape from the dangerous situation required her to use her knowledge of the city and her understanding of the fake driver's operational patterns to create an opportunity for escape when the vehicle was stopped in traffic. Sarah was able to break the rear window of the taxi and escape while attracting the attention of other drivers and pedestrians. Sarah immediately reported the incident to the New York Police Department and the Taxi and Limousine Commission, providing detailed descriptions of the fake taxi and the driver who had attempted to kidnap her. The investigation revealed that Sarah's attacker had been operating multiple fake taxis throughout the city. The investigation led to the arrest of the fake driver and the discovery of a criminal operation that involved multiple modified vehicles that were designed to appear like legitimate taxis while being used for kidnapping, robbery, and assault of unsuspecting passengers. The criminal operation had been targeting passengers throughout New York City for several months. Sarah's experience taught her that the familiar appearance of yellow cabs could be exploited by criminals who used fake taxis to gain access to victims, and that passengers needed to verify the legitimacy of taxi services by checking for proper licensing, working meters, and standard safety features. But if you think fake taxis represent the most dangerous threat that passengers can face, wait until you hear what happened to Marcus in Chicago. Because sometimes the most terrifying transportation experiences involve legitimate taxi drivers who use their licensed positions and knowledge of city geography to isolate and attack passengers who trust that regulated transportation services will provide safe passage to their destinations. Marcus Johnson was a 34-year-old software engineer who regularly used taxi services for transportation to and from Chicago's airports and for business travel throughout the city, relying on cab companies to provide reliable professional transportation that would allow him to maintain his demanding work schedule while traveling efficiently between meetings and transportation hubs. Marcus had been using taxi services in Chicago for over 5 years and was familiar with the city's geography, standard taxi routes, and the professional service standards that legitimate cab companies maintained. Marcus had established relationships with several cab companies that provided consistent, reliable service. On the evening of November 8, 2021, Marcus called for a taxi to take him from his downtown Chicago hotel to O'Hare Airport for a late-night flight, requesting pickup service that would provide adequate time for him to reach the airport and complete his travel preparations. The taxi that arrived appeared to be a legitimate Chicago cab with proper licensing. Marcus entered the taxi and confirmed his destination at O'Hare Airport with the driver, who acknowledged the destination and began driving in what initially seemed to be the correct direction toward the airport. The driver appeared to be professional and knowledgeable about Chicago streets. But as the taxi progressed through the city toward the airport, Marcus began to notice that the driver was taking an increasingly circuitous route that involved unnecessary detours through residential neighborhoods and industrial areas that were not on any direct path to O'Hare Airport. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you've ever realized during a taxi ride that your driver was deliberately taking you away from your destination rather than toward it. Because what Marcus discovered about this route deviation proved that some legitimate taxi drivers exploit their positions to isolate and attack passengers who trust that licensed transportation will provide safe passage. Marcus's concern about the route escalated when he realized that the taxi was traveling in directions that were taking him away from the airport rather than toward his destination, and that the driver seemed to be deliberately extending the trip through areas that were increasingly isolated and unfamiliar. The situation became more alarming when Marcus discovered that the taxi's communication equipment was not functioning properly and that he was unable to contact the cab company or emergency services using the vehicle's standard communication systems. The driver claimed that the radio equipment was experiencing technical problems. Marcus's attempts to use his cell phone to contact emergency services or to track his location were complicated by the fact that the taxi was traveling through areas with poor cellular coverage, and that the driver seemed to be deliberately choosing routes that would minimize Marcus's ability to communicate with the outside world. The fake taxi driver began to drive toward increasingly remote areas outside the city, taking Marcus away from populated neighborhoods and toward rural areas where criminal activities could be conducted without interference from witnesses or law enforcement. The situation escalated when the driver began to make threatening comments about Marcus's business travel, his apparent wealth, and his vulnerability as a business traveler who was unfamiliar with local criminal threats. The driver's knowledge of Marcus' business activities suggested that he had been conducting surveillance of business travelers. Marcus's escape from the dangerous situation required him to wait for an opportunity when the taxi was stopped at a traffic light in an area where other vehicles and potential witnesses were present. Marcus was able to break the taxi's rear window and escape from the vehicle while attracting attention. Marcus immediately contacted the Chicago Police Department and the taxi company that he had originally called for service, discovering that the taxi that had picked him up was not affiliated with the legitimate cab company and that the driver was operating an unlicensed vehicle modified to appear like a legitimate taxi. The investigation led to the arrest of the fake driver and the discovery of a criminal operation that involved multiple individuals who were using modified vehicles to impersonate legitimate taxi services while conducting robberies and assaults against business travelers and other passengers who appeared to be valuable targets. Marcus's experience taught him that business travelers were particularly vulnerable to criminals who used fake taxi services to target people who appeared wealthy or who were unfamiliar with local geography and transportation options. But even fake taxi operations targeting business travelers seem manageable compared to what happened to Jennifer in Las Vegas. Because sometimes the most horrifying transportation experiences involve licensed taxi drivers who exploit their legitimate positions and knowledge of city geography to identify and attack vulnerable passengers, proving that even regulated taxi services can't guarantee passenger safety when drivers abuse their positions of trust. Jennifer Walsh was a 28-year-old conference coordinator who was visiting Las Vegas for a professional event and needed reliable transportation between her hotel, conference venues, and the airport during her business trip. Jennifer had limited experience with Las Vegas taxi services, but assumed that the regulated nature of taxi operations in a major tourist destination would provide safety and professionalism. Jennifer's Las Vegas business trip involved multiple taxi rides during various hours as she traveled between conference events, client meetings, and social activities. Jennifer had been using taxi services successfully during the first several days of her trip and had developed confidence in the reliability and safety of Las Vegas cab companies. On the final night of her Las Vegas trip, Jennifer called for a taxi to take her from a late-night business dinner to her hotel, planning to complete her packing and prepare for an early morning flight home. The taxi that arrived appeared to be a legitimate Las Vegas cab with proper licensing and standard features. Jennifer entered the taxi and provided her hotel address to the driver, who acknowledged her destination and began driving in what initially seemed to be the correct direction toward her hotel. The driver was a middle-aged man who seemed familiar with Las Vegas streets. But as the taxi progressed through Las Vegas toward her hotel, Jennifer began to notice that the driver was making unusual comments about her appearance, her business activities, and her status as a visitor to the city. The driver's comments were increasingly personal and inappropriate. Jennifer's discomfort with the driver, his behavior escalated when she realized that he was asking detailed questions about her hotel room, her travel schedule, and her plans for the remainder of her stay in Las Vegas. The driver's questions were far beyond normal conversation and suggested intelligence gathering. Hit that like button if you've ever had a taxi driver ask inappropriately personal questions about your travel plans or accommodations. Because what Jennifer discovered about this licensed driver's intentions proved that even legitimate taxi drivers can exploit their positions to identify and attack vulnerable passengers who trust that regulated transportation services will provide professional service. The situation became more alarming when Jennifer discovered that the taxi was not traveling toward her hotel, but was instead heading toward isolated areas of Las Vegas that were away from the tourist districts and populated areas where help would be available if she needed assistance. Jennifer's attempts to redirect the driver toward her hotel were met with increasingly aggressive responses, and the driver made it clear that he was not interested in taking Jennifer to her requested destination, but was instead planning to take her to a location where he could conduct whatever criminal activities he had planned. The situation escalated when the driver began to make explicit threats about what he planned to do to Jennifer once they reached his chosen destination, making it clear that his intentions involved assault, robbery, and potentially worse criminal activities. The driver's threats were detailed and credible. Jennifer realized that she was dealing with a predator who was using his position as a taxi driver to identify and attack vulnerable women who were traveling alone and who trusted that taxi services would provide safe transportation. The driver's knowledge of Las Vegas geography suggested experience with these attacks. Jennifer's escape from the dangerous situation required her to wait for an opportunity when the taxi was stopped at a traffic light near other vehicles and potential witnesses. Jennifer was able to open the taxi door and escape from the vehicle while screaming for help and attracting attention. Jennifer immediately contacted the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and reported the attempted assault and kidnapping, providing detailed descriptions of the taxi and the driver who had attacked her. The investigation revealed that Jennifer's attacker was a licensed taxi driver who had been using his legitimate position to identify and attack female passengers. The investigation led to the arrest of the taxi driver and the discovery that he had been responsible for multiple attacks against female passengers over several months, using his knowledge of Las Vegas geography and his position of trust as a licensed driver to isolate and assault women who trusted that taxi services would provide safe transportation. The investigation also revealed that the taxi company had failed to conduct adequate background checks and monitoring of their drivers, allowing a predator to use their legitimate business operations as a cover for criminal activities that put innocent passengers at risk. Jennifer's experience taught her that even licensed taxi drivers could exploit their positions of trust to conduct criminal activities against passengers, and that business travelers needed to maintain awareness of driver behavior and route accuracy even when using legitimate transportation services. These three accounts from taxi passengers across America reveal a disturbing truth about urban transportation. Yellow cabs that should represent safety, convenience, and professional service can become mobile prisons operated by predators who use the trust and familiarity of taxi services to isolate and attack victims who assume that licensed transportation will provide security during their travels. Sarah's encounter with a fake taxi driver in New York City proved that some criminals use modified vehicles designed to appear like legitimate taxis, while being used for kidnapping, robbery, and assault of unsuspecting passengers who trust the familiar appearance of yellow cabs. Marcus's experience with route deviation and kidnapping in Chicago demonstrated that some criminals use fake taxi services to target business travelers who appear wealthy or who are unfamiliar with local geography. Jennifer's assault by a licensed driver in Las Vegas revealed that even legitimate taxi drivers can exploit their positions of trust to identify and attack vulnerable passengers, particularly business travelers and tourists, who appear to be valuable victims for robbery and assault. The most chilling aspect of these accounts isn't just the individual dangers themselves. It's the realization that these threats specifically exploit the trust, familiarity, and vulnerability that make taxi services valuable to millions of urban travelers, turning routine transportation into opportunities for predators to isolate and attack victims who assume their rides will remain safe. Sarah had no warning that hailing a taxi in Manhattan would expose her to a fake driver operating a modified vehicle designed to trap and kidnap passengers who trusted the familiar appearance of legitimate yellow cabs. Marcus had no indication that his business travel routine would attract the attention of criminals who used fake taxi services to target travelers who appeared wealthy and unfamiliar with local geography. Jennifer had no clue that her conference coordination work would expose her to a licensed taxi driver who exploited his legitimate position to identify and attack female business travelers who trusted that regulated transportation services would provide professional service. If you're currently using taxi services, especially during late-night hours or in unfamiliar cities, if you've noticed suspicious behavior from drivers or questionable vehicle conditions, or if you felt uncomfortable during taxi rides, trust your instincts and remember that maintaining awareness could be the difference between safe transportation and a dangerous encounter. Ring that notification bell if these stories have made you more conscious of taxi safety, and remember that understanding these risks and warning signs could help you avoid becoming a victim of predators who use legitimate and fake taxi services to identify and attack passengers. The next time you need to use a taxi, especially during evening hours or in unfamiliar cities, remember these stories and verify the legitimacy of the service. Maintain awareness of your route and destination, and trust your instincts if driver behavior seems inappropriate or threatening. Sometimes the most dangerous part of getting home safely isn't the traffic or the weather conditions. It's the moment when you realize that the person you trusted to transport you safely has intentions that have nothing to do with professional service. Before you go, check out the playlist in the description for more true transportation horror stories that could save your life. Because in the end, the most important thing you can do before getting into any taxi is verify the legitimacy of the service and maintain awareness of potential dangers, and no convenience or cost savings is worth risking your safety with transportation services that may not provide the professional standards that passengers deserve. Comment below if these stories have changed how you think about taxi safety, and remember that the safest ride is one that gets you to your destination securely, even if it means taking extra precautions to verify driver credentials, route accuracy, and vehicle legitimacy before trusting your safety to taxi services. Stay safe out there, and remember that taxi services should provide reliable, professional transportation, not opportunities for predators who exploit the trust and vulnerability of passengers who assume that yellow cabs will deliver them safely to their destinations.